back to basics. So the idea of this presentation here is to explain a little bit how users and groups from a metadata entity perspective relate to when you as a user try to log into DataHub through an authentication process, okay? So with that in mind, assuming that this is working, let me try. No, it was so good yesterday. Oh, wait, here we go. There's a lag here. Sorry about this. So how do they relate? There are essentially 3 steps here, and I've color coded them so that you can relate them afterwards if needed. So an initial step is how you ingest user and group information into DataHub from a metadata graph perspective. So how you can have the notion of users correlate to other entities that you might have in your deployment. A second step that we'll define in yellow is authentication. So how can you actually log in to DataHub? How can you access the UI using credentials so that not everyone can access your particular DataHub instance, and to also identify who you are as a person within DataHub. And finally, the magic sauce here is how you can actually relate and match the user that has just been authenticated to existing users in the metadata graph. So with that in mind, let's first look into users and groups. These are part of the metadata model, and there are 2 instances. One is a corporate user, which essentially models who a person is and what they are doing in relation to other aspects or other entities, I should say, in DataHub. So you're just modeling a person. And you want to do this to answer questions like, who is the owner of X? Who has worked on Y, right? So an example here could be, who is the owner of X dataset? In this case, it would be John, but it could very well be Mary or Jane or someone else. And you want to have this sort of information in DataHub. The other notion is the notion of a corporate group. So this is essentially you're modeling a group of people within DataHub, right? So perhaps you do not have a single owner or a single person responsible for some asset. You have a set of people, and you need to define this in some way. And you're essentially saying, okay, if there is a operations team that is handling the production databases, they are composed of more than one person, you model this as a corporate group, right? It matches very closely to what you would ingest or what you would see, for example, from an LDAP group. And that's what we're trying to do here. If you want to, when you try to ingest these users, or if you want to update them or even delete them, usually the way that this should be done is by using the metadata ingestion framework against data sources like LDAP or IDP, so the identity providers. This depends on your setup, but we support things like Okta and Azure Active Directory, right? There is, however, an extra way of doing this, which is very specific if you're using SSO, which is the first time, if you have DataHub enabled with SSO, the first time that you log in, depending on the configuration, you will be created, or your credentials will be used to create a corporate user within DataHub, even though there may or may not be any relationship to others in the first time. But this is dependent on configuration for this very particular setup. So again, this only happens at the first login, which means that updates do not happen. Or you update it directly in the UI. Though bear in mind here, it's probably best if you do all your changes at the identity provider level, just so you have a single source of truth and there's no mismatch of information, if that might happen. So just a tip on that particular scenario. Also, important notes here. Users and groups only represent people and accounts that have relationships to other datasets, or may have, not currently, but perhaps in the future. It is only used at that level for the entity graph. This is not used for authentication or authorization at all. And that's because DataHub does not have a database or a service to manage users and credentials. What we do is we defer to external services, right? So this is your single sign-on, you're connecting to an external service, or you perhaps have LDAP or JAS with some users and passwords in a file somewhere. So moving on from that, step 2 in this process is authentication. So DataHub currently supports two ways of logging in and being authenticated, which are JAS, so your typical user password combination that you can integrate directly with LDAP, or alternatively SSO. So again, accessing an identity provider to get user information and have that to identify this entity that has connected to DataHub and is doing searches or is running metadata ingestion. Oh, sorry. Yeah, this is for Open Connect, OpenID Connect SSO, not other methods. That's the only one that we support. Thank you, John, for that. And this authentication step serves only to limit and identify who gains access to the UI or to the DataHub components, but it does not affect the metadata graph of information. Okay, so there are two separate and very distinct notions here. One is related to the graph itself, of things that we store and relate in DataHub. The other is how you gain access to these services. So where does the magic happen and how does it happen? When a user becomes authenticated, we try to translate that into a corporate user entity in DataHub. We do this by extracting information from JAS or the OIDC connection, where once we validate the credentials, we map them, and it depends on what you're using. For the JAS use case, we take the username that you used and prefix that with earn li corporate user, and that's the earn of the user that has just authenticated. For OIDC or SSO, it depends on the claim variable that you have configured for DataHub to extract information. So in this case, you would do earn li corporate user and the extracted information. So a simple use case could be that you defined an email as the claim, right? So in my case, let's say it's pedro@acryl.io. That entire string would be used as the suffix for my earn. But perhaps the only thing that I want to do is to have just Pedro, right? I don't want the @acryl.io. So in that case, for claims, I can actually customize the way that I extract that information from the regex. And that is using environment variables, so auth OIDC username regex. And here is the example for that I've just given you. That's how it would work. But bear in mind, and this is a source of a lot of confusion, or a significant amount of confusion that I've seen in the community, is that these earns that we compute when you log in, they must match exactly to the earns of existing corporate users so that you have that match. That's how that's done. It's essentially a lookup that we do on the metadata graph, right? Now, once you've done this, once you've matched it, if you've configured SSO, or by default SSO does this, is automatic metadata provisioning. So I mentioned before that you could do the ingestion via the framework, but you can also do this on the fly when you log in, which is enabled by default, which we will try to provision user and group profiles when users first log in. And this can be something that you might not want, for example, for governance use cases, to only allow access to DataHub, to its UI and to its backend for people who have been previously ingested in the past. And these are the environment variables that you need to look at. Why is this important? Perhaps you just want, for instance, at first for the data team to access DataHub, even though you've enabled SSO. And everyone in your company can use SSO, right? But perhaps you just want a subset of those users to access DataHub for, let's say, perhaps confidentiality purposes. So this is how you can control that sort of thing in an SSO scenario. So just a shout out to that. To generate corporate groups from this first login scenario, you look at the groups claim, and we expect an array of information to be given there, and then generate users based on that. So an example could be, I belong to the engineering, to the data groups. So if they do not exist, DataHub will automatically create these groups for us, right? To give you a sense of what this looks like end to end. And remember, this is only for SSO. So you log in, given that information that the identity provider gives, we extract the email, first name and last name. We create a corporate user from that. And if it does not exist, we add it to the database. And then as a second step, we try to extract the groups. If they exist and are well-formed, we create a corporate group object. Again, we add it if it does not exist. And then the final step is to create a group membership aspect in this created group user to connect to the other groups that we have. So this is how ingestion at a first step, or the first ingestion with SSO happens. However, bear in mind that the reason why I'm actually giving this presentation is perhaps because we found it to be a little bit confusing. I'll admit, I myself was quite confused even when trying to do this presentation, and still am. Sometimes I need to think a little bit to understand how things work. So I completely understand if other people in the community also feel the same. And I want you to know that there is an ongoing conversation of whether this is the right way to go, or if we should do this kind of relationship between metadata and authentication differently. If that's the case, then please, any thoughts that you might have, any opinions, come talk to us, because this is something that can clearly be an issue for people who are onboarding on the first time. And Maggie, that's it on my side. Thank you all for listening to me, and I hope this clarifies a very little bit.